Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see all of you here this morning. Again, especially our visitors. And I'd like you to open your New Testaments to, I think I'm pressing it the right one. You want to forward me there, Kevin? There we go, to Mark 15. And we were in Mark last week, but this is actually the part of our series on the life of Jesus as it's recorded in this gospel. This is a series I'm planning to end in December. I know, gasp. I'm going to be beginning the Gospel of John in January. And so we'll go through the life of Jesus as it's recorded there. This morning we're going to start off where we ended last month, going to repeat verse 15, which is Jesus' interaction with Pilate. The record of Jesus' death and suffering we're going to cover in these next three lessons. This month we're covering the events leading up to the crucifixion. Lord willing, in July we'll cover Jesus' crucifixion in the first 3 hours on the cross, and then in August we will cover the last part of his time on the cross and his death. But again, as we said this morning, I know what the problem is. Turn it on. We're going to be looking at these things, the events that are leading up to his crucifixion, and I want to get us a full picture of what's going on. I want us to understand what Jesus endured during this time. I want us to see what the writers of the Gospels emphasized here, and kind of step back as we like to do and kind of give the big picture before we get into the text itself. All of the texts are going to be on the screen except for this first one. So if you want to keep your Bibles open here to Mark the 15th chapter, we'll be coming back through that in more detail. But let's go ahead and read that verse, that text, starting at verse 15, where it says, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with the staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. So again, let's begin by looking at the bigger picture here. And let me ask, when we think of the suffering of Jesus, what do we generally focus on? What generally comes to our mind? And I think that the thing that generally pops in our mind, just as we have memorialized it here, is actually his crucifixion. There was a profound and unique agony that Jesus suffered that accompanied that form of execution. We've given lessons on that it has its own nuances and pains and ways in which it affected people that were being executed, as opposed to stoning or hanging or some other way. But for us, the images of a nearly naked person, victim, hoisted up on a cross in public for all the crowds to see. The humiliation in just that aspect of it. And then you have the blood that's flowing from the scourging that he endured, the blood flowing from the crown of thorns that had been placed on his head, and the blood from the nails that had been driven into his hands and feet. It's an image that if you and I were there, we would turn away from. It would be so horrifying that we would not be able to look on it. And yet that is not the image that the gospel writers focus on. That is not the suffering of Jesus that they focus on. Jesus' greatest agony and suffering is what is depicted for us as occurring in the garden before his crucifixion. What caused him to sweat these great drops of blood? What caused him to pray for hours that this cup might pass from him? It was not the tortures, or not just the tortures of the cross that he was about to face. It was the drinking of the cup of God's wrath that he was going to be drinking alone. God's wrath that was intended and sufficient for all sinners of all time, that was being given to him. And he would be then our substitute for our punishment. He's going to bear the brunt of that. And that would include the impending separation that Jesus was going to suffer in his relationship with God, a relationship that was eternal until this moment. The four Gospels don't give us a lot of details about the actual crucifixion. In fact, as we'll see in a moment, we would even say they're restrained in their reporting of this. The words that they use are simple words without adjectives. There's no enhancements of it. We don't hear a description of the scourging of Jesus. We aren't told about how they laid him out and pounded the nails into place. We are simply told that they crucified him. And here are all four accounts of where that is recorded. Matthew 27:35, when they had crucified him. Mark 15:24, that we'll look at later, and they crucified him. Luke 23, they crucified him there. John 19, there they crucified him. That's it. That's the full record of that. And part of the reason for that is that historians tell us that there were some 30,000 people over the course of this period of history in Israel that were crucified in the land of Israel. 30,000. That's the population of Port Orchard and Paulsbo combined. 30,000 who would have endured the same pain, the same agony, the same tortures of crucifixion. And on this occasion, with Jesus' crucifixion, there's also going to be two more that are going to be crucified with Jesus. And what I'm telling you is that what occurred there, the act of crucifixion, was very evident, well known to the recipients of these Gospels. They had witnessed it themselves. They had seen it done time and time and time again. It's all too familiar to them. And so just simply saying he was crucified sufficed, because they could call to their minds probably many crucifixions that they had seen. So what we focus on when we think about the sufferings of Christ, which is the cross, which is a perfectly good thing for us to do, it is not what is highlighted in the Gospels. They actually highlight the mistreatment of Jesus before his crucifixion. That's when we get details. They write about the ridicule and the mocking of Jesus in Mark chapter 15 and verse 20. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. And then they led him out to crucify him. Philo tells us that, another Roman historian, that this was life in this part of the world and at this time. That there was just kind of a general cruelty that existed. People would taunt those who were mentally deficient. Not take pity on them, not try to help them, but to make fun of them. And that was the norm. And we would look at that and not be able to believe that people could be that cruel and that heartless. Listen, in the minds of the soldiers of Pilate, Jesus was a lunatic. He was a crazy man. It was a farce to them for him to think he was a king. And adding to that he's a king not of this world. What is that? He's crazy. He's out of his mind. And in general, for the Jews to think that Jesus was a threat to Caesar, and so much of a threat to Caesar that they wanted to make sure that he was killed. Jesus was a joke to the soldiers of Pilate, and the comedy was going to end at Calvary. So when we read in our text here in Mark 15 and verse 15, where it says, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. He wasn't handing him over to be crucified to the Jews. He handed him over to be crucified by his own soldiers. They've already flogged him. And now they're going to lead him out to be crucified. And it's that treatment that we read about in our text from verses 16 to 20. But also in the big picture, I want us to understand that the Romans hated the Jews. And so Pilate's soldiers would revel in taking out that hatred on the king of the Jews. And they're taking out that hatred. And so Jesus is bearing the brunt of their hatred as well. Listen, that's the reason why Pilate put that sign above Jesus' head. That's in verse 19. And the writing that he put above the cross was Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And it says, many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And the sign was written in Aramaic and Latin and Greek. You would be hard-pressed to find a person in Jerusalem that couldn't read that couldn't understand it, that it wouldn't be in some language that they spoke. Pilate wanted everybody to know. This is what happens to people when they think they're king, especially of the Jews. And let's add to this that Jesus knew this was coming. Back in Mark 10, starting verse 33, we're going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death. Will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise. I think it's impressive that Pilate really wanted just to punish him. That's what he said in Luke 23, verse 16. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him. I'll flog him. I'll do damage to him. But he's innocent, so then I'll do that and then release him, even though he's innocent. Of course, the Jews don't want any part of that. So this punishment, this flogging, and others that happened were included in the act of his execution. And that kind of sets, I think, the scene for us. So let's look now at Jesus' pre-crucifixion sufferings in our text here. And of course, back again in verse 15, we read that Jesus was flogged or scourged, wanting to satisfy the crowd. Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. When this happened, a person was tied around a post like this so that the skin on their back was tight. And then the lashing occurred. I'm not going to talk about the flagrum or cat o' nine tails. You just need to realize the damage that was done with that. The laceration of the skin and the muscle right down to the bone. In fact, in some recorded cases, the person never made it to be crucified because they were killed by this. But that was necessary. Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 6. I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. It was all prophesied. The only thing there that we're not told about is them pulling out the hair of his beard as a part of the torture. Ladies, I know nothing about childbirth, but I know about beard hair being pulled. I have turned my face when it's longer and it got caught on a button, and it is agonizing. And to have people just coming up and plucking the beard hair out of I can't even imagine it, let alone all the rest of this. And that doesn't sound like much, but I know what it feels like. And I know how painful it is. And so then Jesus, after that, is then taken. They went off. There. Taken back to the palace or the praetorium. That's in verse 16. And this is what that looked like. This is the palace. You can see, I think, in the picture there, if you look up to the upper right-hand corner, that's where the temple is. It looks like I can recognize those steps down. So this is not Antonio, the Antonio Palace that's next that abuts the cap. This is the praetorium. And you can see this huge, great courtyard that is there in the middle. And we're told here in verse 16 that the entire cohort, all of the soldiers, are the whole company of soldiers. That's 600 men. So there's 600 men here, and they're not there to guard Jesus. They're there to be entertained. And they mocked him, and that's what he's further humiliated, mocked and tortured. And so what did they do as we go down through this in verse 17? They put a purple robe on him. Some of your translations will have a scarlet robe. Listen, purple is very expensive. It's a royal color. And so they're not going to be using real purple. But the color of the robes of the Praetorian Guard were scarlet. And scarlet that has been left out in the sun or has been worn for a long time will fade to a purplish color. And so I think that's what they're using here. And listen, the whole idea is to pretend and mock him that he's a king, that he would be wearing something purple. Because it's a soldier's garment, it's wool, a coarse wool. A coarse wool on a freshly wounded back. And they're mocking his royalty. Next they put on in verse 17 a crown of thorns, and I showed you that last month. That's a mock crown with huge long thorns that they put on his head. And we're all familiar with how head wounds bleed. And here again is where the mocking obeisance as they hail him as king. In Matthew, the 27th chapter, in verse 29, it says, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand. Then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews. Not "Hail Caesar," which is what they normally would have said, but "Hail King of the Jews." And it gets worse in Mark the 15th chapter in verse 19. And again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. The word for staff here is the Greek word kalamus, and it is a word used for bamboo-like reeds that grow in the area there. It is also a word that is used for arrows in the Greek. And so it was solid. And so they're taking this staff and they are hitting him repeatedly, again and again, on the head, and they are spitting on it. So why would they do that? Why are they doing that? I'll tell you what, they are doing that because some of the soldiers who helped arrest him and were at the house of Caiaphas saw the Sanhedrin doing exactly the same thing. In Matthew the 26th chapter in verse 67, and I'm not going to turn there, but it says that they hit him and they spit on him. And they're adding their own, and that was just, again, prophesied. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, this is the description of it right before Isaiah 53, right before the suffering servant. This is the description of the Messiah. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. You know, when God inspired prophets, sometimes he gave them the words, but sometimes they are called visions. And I wonder if Isaiah had to suffer seeing this vision of the servant of God. His face so disfigured, doesn't even look human. Marred beyond human likeness. Then they take that purple robe off and they put on his own clothes. And it says they led him out to be crucified. Being led out to be crucified does not mean that Jesus was just walking along with them. The writer of the Gospel of John in John the 19th chapter, starting at verse 16, says, "So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha." When you picture Jesus carrying his own cross, do not picture a whole cross. That would have been way too heavy for him, even if he was uninjured and full of energy to do. More than likely was just the cross piece, and the cross piece is called the patibulum. The stipes is the part that's upright, and may have already been at Calvary, maybe already set there. But the crossbeam would then be attached when he got there. And this piece of wood, coarse and it's not polished, would have probably weighed, and I'm being conservative here, 75 to 100 pounds. Some estimate it at much higher than that. Robin and I were at Lowe's the other night, and there's some big, like 6x6, 8x8 treated lumber. And I just picked one up. I said, "Robin, pick that up. Just pick up the edge of it." And that was not as heavy as this. Which is why he's not going to make it all the way to this in this journey. In Mark chapter 15 and verse 21, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. I didn't have this in my lesson, but in my translation, verse 22, it says, "And they brought Jesus to the place of Golgotha." And the word for brought there can be translated carried. And so Jesus is going to be borne to Golgotha. He's taken his last steps, perhaps. So why then did the soldiers impress Simon to carry the cross? Maybe it's because Jesus wasn't walking fast enough for them. Maybe it's because he stumbled. We're not told. We don't know why. But I'll tell you one thing. It's on God's timetable that he die at 3 o'clock. Because that's when the Passover lambs were being slaughtered. And this is God's lamb, and he's going to die at the exact same time. So whatever put it in the minds of the soldiers that we need to get this show on the road and we need to get to Golgotha, we need to get to Calvary, they find a convenient Jewish pilgrim who happens to be there at that time, who's just arrived. We're told he's passing by on his way into the country, and that's Simon of Cyrene. So let me give you, just as we close here, a final note about Simon. Remember that the Gospel of Mark was written to a Roman audience, to Christians in Rome. And he tells them about Simon here. I'll get one more thing. He identifies who this Simon is. And he is the Simon, first of all, who is a man of Cyrene. And I'll show you where Cyrene is. Here's Rome up here, so you don't have to search for it. And here's Cyrene, come on, down here. It's on the coast of North Africa. He's obviously a Jew. He's made his maybe once in a lifetime trip to Jerusalem and hoping to get 2 feasts in, the Passover and Pentecost. And he's there and he's put to work. Listen, there were strong churches in Cyrene. They're there because there are Christians who obeyed the gospel, Jews who obeyed the gospel at Pentecost. And in Acts the 2nd chapter in verse 10, specifically we are told that there were pilgrims there from Cyrene and Jerusalem. Then this great persecution that we talked about in our Bible class this morning took place in Acts the 8th chapter in verse 1. A great persecution broke out against the church of Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered. So all of these pilgrims, all these people from all over the world that have come there and who have stayed there for almost 3 years are now being sent home. In fact, it's mentioned again in Acts the 11th chapter in verse 19. Now those who had been scattered by the persecution that broke out when Stephen was killed traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, spreading the word only among Jews. And so as they're going and leaving, they're also spreading the gospel. Well, some of those Christians from Cyrene, next verse, 11 and verse 20. Some of them, however, men from Cyprus and Cyrene, went to Antioch and began to speak to Greeks also, telling them the good news about the Lord Jesus. So Cyrene, post this time that we're reading about here, became a place where Christians were. Strong Christians, dedicated Christians. The other interesting thing that we have in this text is that he identifies him not only as being from Cyrene, but the father of Alexander and Rufus. Why tell them that? Why identify this Simon? This is the Simon. This is the Simon who's the father of Alexander and Rufus, if they don't know who Alexander and Rufus are. This is speculation on my part, but it seems to make sense that this man who was forced to carry the cross of Jesus and pressed into service by the Romans later voluntarily took up the cross of Jesus and obeyed the gospel and became a Christian. Maybe he's one of the 500 that Paul mentions that were witnesses of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I mean, he had a front row seat to begin with by carrying the cross to the place of crucifixion. So what I would say is he was at Pentecost, obeyed the gospel, went back to Cyrene. At some point in time, he moved to Rome, because Paul in Romans chapter 16, I'm pushing the laser. I'm sorry if I flashed any of you guys there. In his greetings, he says, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too." Is Rufus, this Rufus, the same Rufus that Mark mentioned? And he's still there, or he's now there when Paul's writing and has known of that? If so, then his mother would be Simon's wife, or probably widow, because this is like 30 years after Mark 15. Again, possibly another indication of the providence of God, who we have seen and will see is in control of all of this. We lost it again. Conclusion. It's interesting to me that the gospel writers give us a lot more detail about this part of Jesus' suffering than with his crucifixion. And that it concludes with perhaps the identification of a future disciple who has been made to carry the cross of Jesus to Golgotha. But this is the focus of the suffering of Jesus. And as we said, next month we'll look at the first half of the punishment part of it on the cross, and then in August we will finish that. And listen, I know that this is not a pleasant topic, but it tells us clearly what Jesus endured to save us. That fourth verse that Mike read for us at the song before the Lord's Supper, was that number 299, Mike?
Yes.
Somebody want to read the fourth verse for me, because I didn't bring a songbook up with me. Go ahead.
He took my sins and my sorrows. He made them his very own. He bore the burden to Calvary and suffered and died alone.
There. He took our place. That should be us up there. Should be our suffering that we're enduring, and it was his. And so what it boils down to is Jesus is asking us to do what he did, which is what's recorded for us in Matthew 16. Whoever wants to be my disciple, he said, must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. That's the invitation of Jesus, to follow him. And to follow him in exactly the kind of the same way that whatever we're going through in this life, whatever suffering that we're having to endure as he suffered, that will result in glory at the end. The invitation song is "There's a Fountain Free." And we've mentioned this a lot in the past. It's a fountain that's free for you and me. It wasn't free for God and Jesus to provide it for us. It cost a lot. And I don't remember who I heard this from, but it rings in my ears from time to time. If you don't think that you're worth and worthy of salvation, I can tell you exactly how much you're worth to God. You're worth his Son. That's what he paid, to offer you this fountain. And if you'll come to him in faith and submit your life to him, he'll save you. If we can help you with that, please come forward while we stand and sing.